this morning I just want to start with this truth. There are going to be many times when we wind up in deep valleys through absolutely no fault of our own. Our journey through this series of rising from the valleys of life is going to take a kind of drastic turn for the next 2 weeks. And that's because we're going to be focusing on one young man's journey into and through the valley that he found himself in. And his journey into the valley is absolutely terrifying. When we consider what took place with this young man, it's mortifying, to be honest with you. It's horrible, the circumstances of this young man's life, but we can learn from it. And so we're going to do that. And the fact of the matter is this morning, really bad things do happen in this world. Honestly, I think that we all know that. I think that every single one of us is aware of the fact that horrible things do happen in the world, and we probably don't like it. But the fact of the matter is that not only do we know it, it's often our own experience. Who among us hasn't suffered in some way during the course of their life? And so I just want to preface all of this with this idea of really terrible and unfair things do happen in the world that we live in, and it's something that we need to face. It's not something that we should hide from. It's a truth of life. And here's another more important thing. When something bad happens to you, it doesn't mean that you did anything to deserve it necessarily. Sometimes terrible, horrible things happen, and we have to keep living even when they do. Although sometimes when bad things happen, we want to kind of point at them and complain about them and maybe even place blame. But that doesn't help. That really doesn't help us through it. So I want to tell you something else that's also true this morning that you need to know. Just because something terrible happens to you, it also doesn't mean that God is punishing you. It doesn't mean that God has done that terrible thing to you either. In fact, when terrible things happen in our lives, we should put our trust even more in God, because God can take the worst things and in His incredible, miraculous way, God can actually work good out of the horrible circumstances that happen in the world that we live in. So even if the circumstances of our plunge into one of life's valleys are despicable and evil, we need to keep trusting in God. That is so incredibly important. Now, there are a ton of unfortunate circumstances that can lead us into one of life's valleys. But this morning, our message focuses on what is probably the worst of those circumstances. And the worst circumstance is that the worst plunges into life's valleys come through betrayal. Okay, that is your first note this morning in your listening guide. The very worst plunges that we deal with in life, they come through betrayal. And that is exactly what happened to one young man who was betrayed in the most horrific manner by his own brothers. That young man's name was Joseph. And everything that we're about to describe, everything that we're about to look at, began to take place in this young man's life when he was only 17 years old. At only 17, and I understand in a biblical worldview, 17 was considerably more advanced, more mature than we might consider it to be in our present worldview. But regardless of that, I want you to understand that as we look at his plunge into the valley that he would find himself in for decades, he was only 17 years old as it began to begin. And so in order to grasp the depths of his plunge, we do need to know a few things about him. And I know many of you are already pretty aware of Joseph. I get that. But I want to cover some of the high points here. And so one of the first things we need to know about Joseph, Joseph was one of 12 brothers born to a man named Jacob. Even more than being one of 12 brothers, Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. And Jacob, unfortunately, was really obvious about it. And because Jacob was so obvious about his favoritism towards Joseph, it led to a lot of problems between Joseph and his brothers. One of Joseph's tasks, one of the things that really led to the consternation between him and his brothers was the fact that Jacob would send Joseph out to check on his brothers and how his brothers were doing. So Jacob was essentially a shepherd. He had a large flock of sheep, and he would send his sons out, and they would tend to those flocks. And then as they were doing that, he would send their younger brother out to see how they're doing and come back and give a report on them. Sometimes the reports that Joseph would come back and give, they weren't good reports. Sometimes what he saw taking place were not good things. The Bible tells us that. And so as he would come and give these reports back, this would be another problem that would arise in between Joseph and his brothers that would lead to the betrayal that would put Joseph in the valley that will find himself, or that we will find him in this morning. And this really sets the stage for Joseph's plunge here. And so the picture that I want to paint is this. The relationship between Joseph and his brothers was basically kind of like a fire. And then things would come along, whether it was the revealing of a dream, whether it was the giving of a special gift, whether it was the sending out of the youngest son to check on the older sons. And as these things would happen, it was almost like gasoline was being thrown on this fire of hatred that Joseph's brothers had towards him. And ultimately, this is what happens. Jacob had sent his sons out to tend to the flocks, and they were supposed to be in a certain area. And for whatever reason, they had chosen to move on even further away from there. And so he sends Joseph out to check on them. As Joseph goes out to find them, he finds that they're further away. And as he begins to finally get to where they're at and begins to approach his brothers, his brothers see him coming from a distance, and they get extremely angry. Remember, I talked about the idea that there was a fire raging, and almost every little thing that happened would just make the situation worse. As the brothers see Joseph coming, they begin to plot that they are going to kill him, and they're going to go back and tell their father that a wild animal was responsible for what took place with their younger brother. And so at that point, something interesting happens. Joseph's oldest brother steps in to the midst of all this, and he makes a decision, and he decides that no, we're not going to kill him, but instead what we'll do is we'll throw him into a well here. There's a dry well or a cistern. They make the determination that they're going to throw him then into there. The Bible does tell us that the oldest brother intended to actually come back and save Joseph and return him to his father Jacob, but that doesn't wind up actually taking place. And so the brothers actually do this. The brothers actually do take their younger brother, and at 17 years old, he finds himself thrown into this deep, dark cistern in the desert. And then as he is trapped in there, the brothers begin to take a meal outside the hole in the ground where he's at. And when we think about this idea that it is Joseph's own brothers that have put him in this well, the question that comes to mind is it any wonder that so many people in our world struggle with trust issues? What I'm describing here is an extreme case of betrayal, but we see cases of betrayal to lesser instances all of the time. And I just want you to think for a minute, can you even imagine for a moment the terror that would have struck this young man as he's in the bottom of this hole in the middle of the desert, his brothers sitting around taking a meal, not even really caring that he's calling out in distress, begging for his own life. Can you imagine the horror that would have just completely taken him over? And think about the situation that he's in that moment, as he's just begging his brothers to spare his life, looking for any little bit of mercy. I mean, who among us doesn't know the experience of hoping that people will relent of their cruelty and malice? It is so easy for us to be heavy-handed with one another. And the reason why it's so easy for us to be heavy-handed with one another is that we all have an unfortunate propensity to sin. I want to share something that kind of really casts a light on this as I was thinking about this situation where it comes to just people's difficulty with mercy. Some people have such a hard time extending mercy to anybody. And so the issue is so prevalent. I wanted to share something with you. I don't know if you're aware of this or not. Self-defense instructors will actually teach their students not to cry out for help. Did you know that? Self-defense instructors will actually tell their students not to call out for help because so few people will actually respond to that cry and come help them. Instead, what they do is they teach their students to scream out fire, because people will respond to call for fire out of a concern for their own safety. Really, this speaks to the idea of this internal hardship towards mercy that each of us has. And we really see the terrible reality of this on full display in the tragic event of Joseph's betrayal. And as we paint that picture, I just want you to picture him sitting in a dark hole in the ground, his betrayers enjoying a meal over his repeated cries for mercy, and they are still, in the midst of that, they are still unrelenting. In fact, while that is taking place, they begin to conspire with one another to find a way that they can turn a profit out of their younger brother's pain here. And this is what happened. Genesis 37 records the event for us. If you would read this with me, please. When we get to the words that are in yellow, I'll ask you to read those out loud with me. And this is what the Bible records of this moment. It says, looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites on their way from Gilead, their camels loaded with spices, ointments, and perfumes to sell in Egypt. And Judah said, brothers, what are we going to get out of killing our brother and concealing the evidence? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let's not kill him. He is, after all, our brother, our own flesh and blood. Joseph's brothers determined to sell him for a price, and the price is 220 grams of silver. For 220 grams of silver, they take their father's favored son, which was definitely a problem, but they take their father's favored son and they turn him into a slave for 220 grams of silver. His terrible betrayal is complete. Joseph arrived through absolutely no fault of his own. Joseph did nothing for this to have taken place. Through no fault of his own, he finds himself in the valley. And he is going to remain there for a very, very long time. But listen, even in the valley, we have to understand there is still hope, because God is not limited by worldly circumstances. Okay? that means that even when people we trust betray us, we haven't necessarily been abandoned. And we see that very reality in Joseph's life, because although his brothers betrayed him, God never abandoned him. Okay, God never abandoned Joseph. And this is going to be an extremely important truth as we continue to look at Joseph's continued existence in this valley that he finds himself in. That is the second point on your listening guides this morning. God never abandoned Joseph. And this is one of the hardest things for many people to accept. Bad things happen in this world. Every single one of us has experienced something horrible that's taken place in our lives. Every single one of us. But when something bad happens, it does not mean that God has abandoned you. And this is tough, because if you're a Christian, sometimes we link what's happening in our lives to our faith. There are times when we feel like, oh my goodness, this terrible thing is happening to me. It must mean that my faith isn't strong enough. But that is not true. That is absolutely not true. I want to share with you something that was written to the church in Rome. And it was written by Paul. Paul, of course, wrote more letters that are in our Bible than anyone else. And I want you to understand, there's no doubt in my mind. I'm not saying that Paul wrote these words because of what happened to Joseph. But when Paul wrote these words, he absolutely knew Joseph's story and what happened to him. And so read this with me. This is Romans 8:28, and it reads this way: and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. And it is incredibly difficult to see how what happened to Joseph could ever be considered a good thing. It's hard to see what good could come out of that situation, but we have to understand something. We have a limited perspective. We don't have God's perspective. Okay, God has an overarching perspective. We don't see all the way to the end of a tragedy. In fact, one of our most difficult obstacles to overcome when something bad happens in our lives is that we tend to become blinded by the thing that just happened. We tend to become so focused on something bad when it happens in our life that we have a hard time seeing past it at all. It makes it really hard to keep going forward when bad things happen, but we can keep going, and we see that in Joseph. The Ishmaelites who bought him brought him to Egypt, and then they sold him there to an Egyptian official, and that official's name was Potiphar. And we have to be honest at this point. Isn't it hard to see how a person could be kidnapped by his brothers and then sold not once but twice? Isn't it hard to see how that could possibly benefit not just him but anybody? It is a hard and difficult truth to face, but we do read something that helps us understand how it's possible. And what we're about to study really helps us understand sort of where we're going in our Rising from the Valley series for the rest of this week and next week also, because it has to do with where God is while we're there. And so Genesis 39:2 tells us something incredibly important about Joseph, but also something incredibly important that we really need to put this in our heart, because I'm going to tell you, if you're not struggling through a valley right now, that's great, but I'm sure that you're going to find yourself in one again at some point. And so this is Genesis 39:2. And if you would read what's in yellow with me, we'll take a look and see how is it possible that there could be any benefit from what has been transpiring in the life of this young man, Joseph. And it reads this way: the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. God God was with Joseph. And because of God's favor, because God was with him, and because God's favor was on him, Joseph became trusted. He became a reliable worker for Potiphar. In fact, Joseph is so trustworthy in this that Potiphar puts him in charge of all of his personal affairs. And we even know why Potiphar did it, because of what we read further in Genesis 39:3. So why did Potiphar see all that in Joseph? What made that possible? Well, this is what made it possible. His master, remember, this is Potiphar. His is Joseph. Joseph's master, Potiphar, saw that, and the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And right now I want to take a moment and I just want to reset the situation a little bit, because sometimes when we read the Bible, you have to understand, we read the Bible and it's not rare for in a chapter 10 years to have gone by and we're not aware that 10 years went by, because we're only getting the high points, right? So we only get the high points, and we have to be a little bit cautious when we read this. So I want to reset what's happening with Joseph and the tragedy that's going on, because when we look on, here we are thousands of years after this event. And even as I'm going through this, I'm touching on the high points of the high points. And if we're not careful, when we look at the Bible, there's always the chance that we'll miss things. We'll not understand things. And the thing that we really need to understand, even as we read something as beautiful as the Lord was with Joseph, right? Or that the Lord was blessing or prospering Joseph or making him successful, I want you to understand Joseph is still suffering. At this point in the story, Joseph is still a slave. I mean, he might be a trusted slave, but he's still a slave, and he wasn't born that way. Joseph was not born into slavery. Joseph was born the favored son of his father, one of 12 brothers. And even more, if we were to take all of the math from like Genesis chapter 35 through 50, if we do all the math, and if we are careful to parse out at what point in the story each thing is happening, what we just read about Joseph having the Lord with him and Potiphar raising him up among his servants because the Lord was prospering him. What we don't realize is that at this point in the story, Joseph is 27 or 28 years old now. A decade. You see what happens with the high points when we're not cautious and careful? A decade has gone by for Joseph in slavery. He remains a slave after all this time. This young man isn't even 30 years old yet, and he has now spent a decade or more of his life as a slave. And he was not born that way. And even worse, and this has got to be the really difficult part, there is no one looking to come save him. Okay, I want you to understand that. And from Joseph's perspective, he has no hope that someone's coming to save him. I want you to think back. Think back to Joseph's time in that cistern as his brothers are making plans, as he's down there crying out in distress to be given mercy. He hears the plan. He knows the plan. The plan is to go back to Jacob and present as though Joseph has been killed by wild animals. His father, Jacob, is not coming to the rescue, and Joseph would know that. His brothers, they're certainly not coming for him. This young man, at this point in time, even though we read that God is with him, even though we read that God is blessing his work of his hands, and that it is such to the point that God blesses him, that this Egyptian who doesn't believe in God understands that Joseph's God is doing this. And even through all that, the thing that we have to remember is Joseph is still in that valley. Joseph is still suffering. The only thing that's truly happened at this point is that Joseph went from being the favored son of his father to now being the favored son of his Egyptian master. Or I'm sorry, the favored slave of his Egyptian master. That's the circumstance that he finds himself in. And we have to be careful when we read this to understand God has not lifted Joseph out of the valley, but God is with Joseph in the valley. If we were to just take chapter 39 of Genesis and open it up and just read it straight through, we would read 7 different times in chapter 39 that God is with or that God is blessing Joseph through this period of time. And it's a little bit hard to accept that. Because if I look at this from my own personal perspective, if I were Joseph, man, I would want to be rescued from slavery. If God is with me, God, why aren't you calling me out of this? And haven't you ever felt that way? I know you have. We've all felt that way. God, if you're with me, why are you letting this continue to happen? And so it doesn't even sound possible that God is with him, that God is blessing him, that God is making him successful while he remains a slave, but it doesn't change the fact that that is true. That is so true. In fact, I want you to understand something, and we really need to understand just how into the valley, how deep is the plunge that Joseph is in right now, because I want to tell you something. It is about to get even worse. Joseph's situation is about to get even worse because he's about to be betrayed again. And this time he's going to be betrayed by the wife of Potiphar, his master, who has raised him up in his own household to be in charge of all of his affairs. And Joseph is about to be betrayed again, and it does not change the truth that God is with him. And we need to know that. But we are going to pick up with that part of Joseph's plunge next week. And it leaves us with this question this morning: what can we do? Okay? What can we do about the truth that we have learned? And the truth that we've learned is this: there are going to be times when we wind up in life's valleys. And many, many times that is going to have anything to do with anything we've done. We will wind up in the valleys even though we didn't do anything to put ourselves there. And that's the truth. But what can we do about that truth? What can we learn from what we discover here with Joseph? This is what we need to do. When you find yourself in one of life's valleys, and I hope you're paying very close attention, because I promise you this, you're going to find yourself in one. When you find yourself in one of life's valleys through no fault of your own, keep trusting God. Keep trusting God and don't give up. And even more specifically, don't give up hope. When you find yourself in one of life's valleys, don't give up hope. And even more than that, do not surrender to the circumstances that you find yourself in. Because God is present. I want to share with you some words written thousands of years ago by the great prophet Isaiah. And I told you earlier that when Paul was writing Romans, of course Paul was completely aware of Joseph's story. Many of you are aware of Joseph's story already. But as Isaiah is writing these words, he is also aware of Joseph's story. And I want to point something else out. Of course he wrote this. Look who he wrote it to. Oh, Jacob, Israel. That is Joseph's father. I mean, he's speaking literally to the people and not Joseph's father, but that is who Jacob is. And so read this with me and just keep in mind the plight of finding yourself in a valley that you did not put yourself in, that you do not have any hope of someone else coming and rescuing from. But just read these words with me. Why would you ever complain, O Jacob, or whine, Israel, saying, God has... lost track of me. He doesn't care what happens to me. Don't you know anything? Haven't you been listening? God doesn't come and go. God lasts. Listen, I don't know. I don't know why our journeys through the valleys of life can be so long sometimes. I'm not God. Amen. I am not God. I don't know why they can last so long. But I know when you're in them, every second can be excruciating. I know that. I know this. I know that just because you're in one of life's valleys, that doesn't mean God has forgotten about you. And that doesn't mean God is not fully aware of the pain that you are feeling in that circumstance, in that horrible situation. I know that if you've been in that valley for a long time, it doesn't mean God is punishing you. It doesn't mean that. God was not punishing Joseph when his brothers betrayed him that horrible, terrible day. Can you imagine what a travesty that would be? When his brothers did that to him, God was not punishing him. God was with him. Sometimes people do horrible, disgusting things to other people. That is just the truth of the world that we live in. We live in a broken world. We live with broken people. I'm broken. Each one of you is broken. You won't meet another person out there who's not broken also. And sometimes all that brokenness leads to some horrible things getting done to other people. But don't make the mistake of blaming God for sinful things that people do. Never make that mistake. God is not responsible for anyone's sins. I want you to hear that again. God is not responsible for anyone's sins. Each person is accountable for their own sins. And when bad things happen in this world, that is a reason for us to turn to God, to seek Him out in every way that we possibly can. It is a reason to race towards Him with our arms as wide open as they can possibly go. But it is not a reason to blame God. Too often people get angry with God for the sinful things that God Himself hates. In the valleys, where things are so incredibly difficult, don't blame God. Trust God. Trust Him more than ever. I want to share something else that Isaiah wrote thousands of years ago. Most of us have a certain level of familiarity with this verse. But I really want to share this verse in light of the idea that there are times when we will feel defeated, we will feel abandoned, we will feel alone. It will have had nothing to do with anything we did on our own. Yet these words ring true, and Isaiah writes them in verse 40 and 31. But those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar high on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. Man, when we find ourselves in one of life's emotional or situational valleys and we need strength, it is to the Lord that you should go for it. If you seek within yourself, there's a chance that you'll come up short. But if you go to God, you never will. Ever come up short. And even if you've been in the valley for a long time, sometimes something happens in our lives that we struggle badly to get past. Can I get an amen? There are things that happen sometimes that are so hard for us to get past that we will carry it for years, and we will carry it for years. And even if you feel as though you have been in your valley of suffering or pain or abandonment or loss, even if you feel as though you've been there for years and years, I encourage you this morning to trust in God, because God knows what He has in store for you and everybody else on the other side of that thing. And only God knows that. Trust him in the valley. Listen, next week we're going to pick back up with Joseph in the valley. It is so incredibly important that we remember as we consider this man's life that he was not lifted out just because he found favor in Potiphar's house. That is not what happened. He was still in the valley in that moment, and God was with him. So do this. Do this. If you find yourself in a similar situation, keep trusting God, because he is always worthy of your trust, even if you're in the valley, especially if you are in the valley. Let's pray.